Loretta Vance was 71 years old when her husband of 40 years, Victor, looked her in the eye and told her she would never survive a single month without his name and his wallet to protect her. He didn't just leave her, he humiliated her, throwing her into the cold with nothing but a single suitcase and a heart full of shame. But instead of fading away as he expected, Loretta did something that made the entire town of Oak Haven, Kentucky, laugh with mockery. She took her last few crumpled dollars and bought a ruined, biohazardous shack at a municipal auction for the symbolic price of just $4. Everyone thought she had finally lost her mind, including Victor, who publicly ridiculed her for buying a landfill. Little did they know that the rotting floors and the overgrown jungle of the Sterling property were hiding a secret buried since the 1950s, a subterranean discovery beneath the garden that would not only restore Loretta's dignity, but would eventually bring Victor's entire empire to its knees. This is the story of how a woman discarded as trash found the master key to a legacy that left the world speechless. Before we see exactly what Loretta found beneath that Kentucky soil, I'd love to know where you are joining us from today. We truly value our global community and love seeing how far these stories travel, so please leave a comment with your city or country, and don't forget to subscribe and like this video to help us grow. You might notice that I am a digital presenter sharing this story today. We want to be completely transparent, because we know many of our viewers have mixed feelings about this approach. We read every one of your comments and understand the preference for a human face, but currently, YouTube has been removing many channels that don't utilize this specific presentation format. You may have noticed some of your favorite story channels suddenly vanishing. This is often the reason why. While we are constantly working to improve and find better alternatives, we use these tools so we can continue sharing these narratives with you. It is also important to know that every story on this channel is crafted by a dedicated team of real people who pour their hearts into every word. While we use artificial intelligence as a tool, the soul of the story always comes from human hands. But to truly understand how Loretta Vance went from a submissive wife who whispered so as not to disturb her husband's thoughts to the powerful woman standing over a hidden vault, we must look past the triumph and go back to the beginning of her ordeal. We need to travel back to Oak Haven in late autumn, to a time when the sky was the color of lead and the morning frost was just beginning to turn the Kentucky mud into iron. It was a time when Loretta still believed that her worth was measured by the man who stood beside her, unaware that she was about to be pushed to the very edge of her existence. The journey from the luxury of a mansion to the damp rot of a $4 ruin didn't happen overnight. It was a path paved with decades of silence and a final crushing betrayal that left her with nothing but her name and a handful of damp, crumpled bills. This is where the mask of a perfect marriage finally fell away, revealing the cold, calculating greed that would set the stage for the most unexpected transformation Oak Haven had ever seen. For 40 years, 71-year-old Loretta Vance had moved through the polished marble halls of the Vance estate like a ghost that had forgotten how to haunt. To understand the woman who eventually stood in the mud of a $4 ruin, one must first see the woman who spent 4 decades becoming invisible. Victor Vance, her 73-year-old husband, didn't just rule Oak Haven's business sector. He ruled the very air Loretta breathed, treating her like a piece of high-end furniture that had simply lost its luster over time. For decades, Loretta had lived in a state she called the silence of the appliance, functioning perfectly and quietly in the background, never allowed to disturb the important thoughts of the man she served. Every morning, the rhythmic, high-pitched clink, clink, clink of Victor's gold signet ring tapping against the mahogany breakfast table served as a metronome for her submissiveness, a sound designed to remind her that her time was not her own. She had learned to whisper so as not to draw his ire, a habit that had eventually hollowed out her spirit until she felt as thin and fragile as the parchment skin on the back of her arthritic hands. The tragedy of Loretta's invisibility was that she had once been a woman of vibrant, intellectual ambition. a version of herself that Victor had systematically dismantled. At the age of 19, Loretta had been a brilliant student, clutching a full scholarship to a prestigious botanical institute that promised a life of scientific discovery and growth. But Victor, already showing the cold, controlling edges of his personality, had snuffed that fire out with a single, devastating sentence. "A wife's place is in her husband's kitchen, not a laboratory, Loretta." She had chosen love, or what she then believed was love, and traded her microscope for a rolling pin, effectively burying her dreams before they could even take root. This was the first of many deep cuts, a pruning of her potential that she accepted in the name of a marriage that would eventually become her cage. She convinced herself that his strength was a shield for her, never realizing that the shade tree of her marriage had grown so thick and suffocating that she had completely forgotten what the sun felt like on her face. In the mid-'80s, when Victor's first business venture was spiraling toward a humiliating bankruptcy, Loretta had stepped forward with the only thing she truly owned, her grandmother's antique heirloom jewelry. She didn't hesitate to sell the emeralds and the gold that represented her maternal lineage, handing the proceeds to Victor without a single condition, believing that a partnership meant lifting each other up in times of failure. Victor took the money, rebuilt his empire, and then spent the next 30 years rewriting the history of his success to exclude her entirely. He never mentioned the jewelry again. Instead, he cultivated a narrative of the self-made man who succeeded, despite having a wife who offered nothing but domestic maintenance. To Victor, Loretta's sacrifice wasn't a gift, it was a duty, a basic requirement for her continued residence in the house he now considered his alone. He was a pesticide, systematically killing everything beautiful and organic in her life, just to keep the lawn of his public reputation looking neat and prosperous for the town of Oakhaven. As the years turned into decades, the mask of the successful couple began to slip, revealing the cold, calculating greed that Victor had been nurturing beneath his expensive suits. He had become obsessed with his image as a great man, and in his eyes, a 71-year-old wife with silver white hair and a slight stoop was no longer a fitting accessory for a king. The psychological warfare intensified, manifesting in small, cruel gestures designed to make Loretta feel like a burden. He would leave brochures for senior transition communities on the kitchen counter, or comment on how the smell of her herbal teas made him nauseous, preferring the sterile, artificial scents of his corporate world. He began to speak about her in the third person while she was standing right in front of him, telling his business associates that Loretta is getting a bit fragile these days, a lie intended to lay the groundwork for her eventual disposal. He was preparing the soil for her removal, making sure that when the time came to uproot her, the community of Oakhaven would see it as an act of mercy rather than an act of malice. The final betrayal didn't arrive with a scream, but with the cold blue light of a digital photo frame that Victor had placed in his new home office. Loretta had walked in to bring him tea, only to see a cycle of high-definition photos featuring Victor and a 40-year-old woman she didn't recognize. His new fiancée. The images showed them on yachts and at galas, vibrant and laughing, a life that Victor was already living while Loretta was still doing his laundry in the basement. When she confronted him, her voice trembling like a leaf in a storm, Victor didn't even look up from his desk. He simply told her that he had decided to refresh his life, and that she was no longer part of the design. The cruelty was surgical. He made sure that the photo frame kept running in her bedroom as she spent her final nights in the mansion, a constant, glowing reminder that she had already been replaced. He had spent 40 years using her as a foundation, and now that the building was complete, he was more than happy to let the ground beneath him crumble away. The legal proceedings that followed were nothing more than a formal execution of Loretta's dignity, led by attorney Bradley Thorne, a 45-year-old man who functioned as Victor's personal fixer. Thorne was a man of sharp angles and even sharper words, possessing a corrupt legal mind that saw people as nothing more than obstacles to be cleared. During the divorce settlement meetings, the atmosphere was as cold as a Kentucky winter, the air thick with the smell of expensive cologne and the bitter, burnt taste of the cheap coffee Loretta forced herself to drink. Thorne would sit across from her, his eyes as vacant as a shark's, tapping his expensive fountain pen as he pushed stacks of documents toward her. He spoke to her with a condescending tone that implied she was mentally incompetent, ignoring the fact that she had managed the household and his client's personal life for nearly half a century. Every time Loretta tried to ask about her fair share of the assets she had helped build, Thorne would dismiss her with a smirk that felt like a slap. The dialogue at the divorce table was a masterclass in dehumanization, with Victor leaning back in his chair, his signet ring still clinking against the wood like a ticking clock. "I've given you 40 years of luxury, Loretta," Victor said, his voice flat and devoid of any shared history. "You've forgotten how the world works. Without my name and my wallet to protect you, you're just a ghost in a cardigan. You wouldn't know how to survive a single month on your own." Loretta looked at him, seeing for the first time the hollow man behind the expensive suit. And she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years, a quiet, burning indignation. "A ghost doesn't have to worry about the floor creaking under its feet, Victor," she replied in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, yet it seemed to echo in the sterile room. "I think I'll enjoy the silence." Bradley Thorne let out a short, mocking laugh, not even bothering to look at her as he added, "Sign the papers, Mrs. Vance. At your age, fair is just a word people use for a carnival." Loretta signed the papers, her hand shaking not from fear, but from the sheer weight of 40 years of suppressed rage. The settlement left her with almost nothing. Victor had used every legal loophole and hidden offshore account Thorne could devise to ensure she walked away with only her clothes and a small pittance of cash. As she left the lawyer's office, the realization of her total abandonment hit her like a physical blow. She was 71 years old. Her family had moved away or been alienated by Victor years ago, and she was being cast out into a world that she no longer recognized. The shade tree was gone, and she was standing in the middle of a clearing, exposed and vulnerable. But as she walked through the lobby of the courthouse, she gripped her purse tightly, feeling the small, hidden envelope containing the $142. $60 she had painstakingly saved from the grocery money over the last 3 years. It was a pathetic amount, yet it was the only thing in the world that truly belonged to her, a tiny, dormant seed of independence. The day of the move-out was a grim, rainy morning that turned the Kentucky bluegrass into a sea of gray and brown. Victor had already moved most of his belongings to a new penthouse, but he had left orders for the movers to be efficient, which translated to throwing Loretta's few remaining items into a single, battered suitcase. She stood in the foyer of the mansion she had kept immaculate for 4 decades, watching as strangers carried away the furniture she had polished and the rugs she had vacuumed until her back ached. There was no goodbye from Victor. He had sent Bradley Thorne to oversee the eviction instead. The lawyer stood by the front door, checking his gold watch and looking at his phone, clearly irritated that he had to spend his morning dealing with a discarded appliance. The smell of damp wool and the chemical scent of moving boxes filled the air, a funeral shroud for the life she was leaving behind. Loretta felt a deep, hollow ache in her chest, a mourning for the woman she could have been if she had never met the man who was now erasing her. As Loretta packed her final suitcase, she found a pair of thin, plastic-wrapped flowers on her bed, the kind you find at a cheap grocery store, with a note from Victor that read, "A little something for your new home. Trash belongs with trash." The flowers felt oily and artificial in her hands, A final, stinging insult from a man who knew she loved the smell of real soil and living things. She didn't cry. She simply placed the flowers in the trash can and closed her suitcase. She was leaving with 3 changes of clothes, a plastic bin of old, rusted gardening tools that Victor hadn't bothered to claim, and the heavy weight of 40 years of failure. As she walked toward the front door, she passed the digital photo frame one last time. It was still cycling through images of the new fiancé, a glowing neon mockery of Loretta's long years of service. She reached out and unplugged it, the screen going black with a soft, electronic sigh, the only small victory she would have that day. The final moment of her expulsion occurred on the courthouse steps in the middle of a freezing downpour that seemed to soak through her very bones. Bradley Thorne was waiting for her, holding the keys to the ruined Sterling property she had just purchased at the municipal auction with her last few dollars. He didn't hand them to her with any sense of professional courtesy. Instead, he looked at the rusted heavy iron ring and intentionally let it slip from his fingers. The keys hit a puddle of oily black water with a sharp splash, sinking into the mud at Loretta's feet. "Careful, Mrs. Vance," Thorne said with a smirk that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Don't slip! A broken hip is much more expensive than that shack you just bought. You're lucky Victor didn't just leave you on the sidewalk." He turned and walked toward his luxury sedan without another word, the sound of his expensive shoes clicking on the stone like a final, dismissive heartbeat. Loretta stood alone in the rain, the cold water dripping from the brim of her hat and running down the back of her neck. She looked down at the keys submerged in the oily puddle, reflecting the gray, leaden sky of Oakhaven. Her knees were stiff with arthritis, and her breath came in short, shallow bursts. But she didn't call for help. Slowly, methodically, she reached down and plunged her hand into the freezing mud, her fingers closing around the cold, jagged iron of the Sterling keys. The water was biting, a sharp, tactile reminder of the reality she now faced. But as she pulled the keys from the muck, she gripped them so hard the metal bit into her palm like small teeth. She didn't look back at the courthouse or the direction of the mansion. She simply turned her face toward the horizon, where the dark, skeletal trees of the Appalachian foothills stood against the storm. She was a woman with no home, no husband, and no future that anyone else could see. But as she clutched those muddy keys, she felt the first, faint vibration of the magnetic intuition humming in her chest. The journey from the mansion to the outskirts of town felt like a descent into another world, a slow transition from the land of the living to the land of the forgotten. Loretta walked toward the edge of Oakhaven, where the paved roads gave way to cracked asphalt, and the houses became smaller and more dilapidated. She passed the local market where she had spent 40 years shopping for Victor's favorite meals, but she didn't stop. She couldn't afford to even look at the windows. The air was thick with the scent of damp leaves and wood smoke, the smell of a Kentucky autumn that was rapidly turning into a bitter winter. She felt the eyes of the townspeople on her, the whispers of "Poor Loretta," and the muffled laughter of those who had seen her bid $4 on a biohazard. She was the town's new joke, the woman who had traded a palace for a landfill, and she could feel the weight of their pity like a heavy, wet blanket. As she reached the boundary of the Vance estate for the very last time, crossing the threshold of the iron gates she had entered as a young bride, Loretta didn't feel the surge of grief she had expected. Instead, she felt a strange, terrifying lightness, as if the heavy chains of the appliance mindset were finally beginning to fray. She was no longer a wife, a hostess, or a silent shadow. She was just a woman in a gray cardigan, carrying everything she owned in a single, battered bag. She looked at her hands, the knuckles swollen and the skin translucent, and realized they were no longer bound by Victor's signet ring. The mansion stood behind her, a monument to a life of service that had yielded nothing but a handful of mud and a broken heart. She took one final breath of the air that belonged to Victor Vance, air that smelled of furniture polish and cold, expensive silence. And then she stepped out onto the public road, leaving the ghost of the woman she used to be standing at the gate. The exit was complete, and as the gates of her former life swung shut with a heavy final thud, Loretta Vance began the long walk toward the ruin she had bought for $4. She didn't know then that the rotting floors and overgrown jungle of the Sterling property were waiting for her, or that the earth itself was preparing to reveal a legacy that would dwarf Victor's empire. All she knew was that she was 71 years old. She was alone in the rain, and she was the only one who held the keys to her own survival. The shade tree was gone, but for the first time in 40 years, the cold, gray light of the Kentucky sky was falling directly on her, and Loretta Vance, the woman who was told she would never survive, took her first step into the winter, her grip on the muddy keys as firm as the iron that had forged them. The freezing Kentucky rain was no longer just a weather pattern. It had become a cold, gray shroud that seemed to fall specifically on Loretta's shoulders as she walked away from the courthouse. Each step she took toward the outskirts of Oakhaven was a heavy, wet struggle. Her shoes, once polished for high society galas, now acting as sponges for the icy mud of the Appalachian foothills. She clutched her single, battered suitcase with a grip that turned her arthritic knuckles into white stones. Her body hunched against the biting wind that whipped through the skeletal white oaks. The rain seeped through her thin cardigan, washing away the last lingering scent of the expensive furniture polish that had defined her existence for 40 years. She didn't look back at the direction of the mansion, for she knew that the woman who had lived there was already a ghost, a discarded shadow that Victor had erased with a cold, calculated efficiency. Now, she was just a 71-year-old woman with a heavy bag and a heart that felt as leaden as the storm-tossed sky, moving toward a destination that most people in town considered a joke. As she reached a small, sheltered bus stop on the edge of the residential district, Loretta finally allowed herself to stop, her breath coming in short, ragged puffs of white mist. With trembling fingers, she reached into the hidden pocket of her purse and pulled out the small, damp envelope she had guarded like a sacred relic for 3 long years. Inside were the remains of her secret grocery savings, exactly $142.60, representing thousands of tiny, silent rebellions against Victor's total financial control. It was a pathetic sum for a woman of her age, a fortune that wouldn't even cover a single tire on Victor's luxury SUV, yet it was the only thing in the world that truly belonged to her. She counted the crumpled bills twice, her eyes stinging not from the wind, but from the sheer, terrifying weight of her own independence. This was her entire life's value in the eyes of the man she had served, a handful of paper that had to somehow bridge the gap between a mansion and a miracle. The walk continued for another mile, the paved roads of the wealthy district giving way to cracked asphalt and the thick, tangled overgrowth of wild honeysuckle and black walnut trees. By the time the Sterling property came into view, the gray afternoon had begun to settle into a bruised purple twilight. The house didn't look like a home. It looked like a corpse, a skeletal ruin of gray wood and shattered glass that had been strangled by decades of aggressive vines. A faded yellow biohazard sign was still stapled to the front door, a warning that Attorney Thorne had used to justify the $4 price tag, though Loretta suspected the only hazard here was the truth. The air around the property was thick with the scent of wet earth and ancient neglect, a heavy stillness that seemed to swallow the sound of the falling rain. As she stood at the rusted gate, the magnetic intuition hummed in her chest again, a low, grounding vibration that told her she wasn't looking at a landfill, but at a sanctuary that had been waiting specifically for her. Crossing the threshold of the Sterling house was like stepping into a tomb that had forgotten how to stay closed. When Loretta pushed open the heavy front door, she was hit by a physical wall of suffocating heavy scents. The sharp tang of black mold, the cloying smell of rotted drywall, and the dusty metallic odor of abandoned decades. Her flashlight, its batteries already flickering with a dying yellow light, revealed a kitchen that was a masterpiece of decay. The linoleum floor was curled like dried skin, and the ceiling was weeping directly onto the counters, a lonely, hollow drip. Drip, drip, hitting an empty tin can with a sound that echoed like a slow, mechanical heartbeat through the empty rooms. There was no heat, no light, and no comfort to be found in the shadows of the rotting wood. Loretta felt a sudden, sharp pang of regret, a cold realization that Victor might have been right, that she was nothing more than a discarded appliance, whose wires had finally been cut by the world. She found a corner of the kitchen that seemed relatively dry and sat on her suitcase, the cold of the floorboards seeping through her clothes and settling into her bones like a permanent frost. In the dim, flickering light of her flashlight, she caught her reflection in a cracked piece of glass leaning against the wall, and for a fleeting, terrifying moment, she saw exactly what Victor wanted her to see. She saw a broken, unfixable woman who was as discarded as the moldy wallpaper peeling from the ceiling. The silence of the house was absolute, a heavy pressure that seemed to demand she lay down and let the rot take her, too. Her knees were already turning a dark blue-black from the physical strain of the day, a map of bruises that felt like a physical manifestation of her failure. In that hollow hour of the night, the weight of 71 years of submissiveness threatened to crush her, and the whisper of the appliance mindset told her it would be so much easier to simply give up. Then, as she reached down to adjust her position on the hard suitcase, her hand brushed against something small and vibrant growing through a jagged crack in the rotted floorboards. It was a tiny, stubborn sprout of wild mint, its leaves a defiant emerald green against the gray decay of the kitchen. Loretta reached out to pull it, thinking it was just another sign of the house's ruin. But as her fingers touched the leaves, the fragrance hit her, sharp, clean, and incredibly powerful. It was the smell of life refusing to be stifled by the dark, a scent that cut through the odor of mold and rot like a silver blade. In that moment, the mental garden she had built to survive Victor's cruelty suddenly became real. She realized that if a tiny weed could find the strength to push through iron-hard mud and rotted wood, then she was not the ruin around her. "I am not the ruin," she whispered into the darkness, her voice cracking but firm. "I am the gardener." The next morning arrived with a pale, watery sun that struggled to penetrate the grime on the windows. But the silence was broken by a sound Loretta hadn't expected, the heavy metallic clank of a gate being forced open. Standing on the front porch was 72-year-old Doris Miller, a woman with iron gray hair and a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters that looked entirely too large for her thin frame. Doris was a retired librarian who had been Loretta's only friend before Victor had systematically isolated her, and she stood there now with a thermos of hot soup and an expression of fierce, quiet rebellion. "You look like you've been wrestling with a bear, Loretta," Doris said, her voice a warm, familiar anchor in the cold air of the ruin. Loretta looked at her, the first tear of the entire ordeal finally escaping, and carving a path through the dust on her cheek. "Worse, Doris," she replied with a weary smile. "I've been wrestling with a house that doesn't want to be found." Doris didn't offer empty platitudes or pity. Instead, she handed Loretta a cup of soup that tasted like the first real nourishment she'd had in a lifetime, its warmth spreading through her chest like a slow fire. "Well, lucky for you, I brought a crowbar and a thermos of hope," Doris said, looking around at the rotted kitchen with the practiced eye of a woman who had spent 40 years cataloging the world's secrets. "He took your house, Loretta, but he forgot you're the one who knows how to build a home. Now, let's see what this old girl is hiding under all this dust." Within an hour, Doris was already at work in the attic, her librarian's intuition leading her to a loose floorboard near the chimney. When she pulled it back, she didn't find jewelry or gold, but a weathered, leather-bound diary wrapped in oilcloth, the first recorded words of Elias Sterling. The man who had built this property before the town of Oakhaven tried to erase him from its memory. The arrival of help didn't stop with Doris. By that afternoon, a rusted, roaring flatbed truck pulled into the overgrown driveway, driven by Silas Rusty Young. Silas was 68, a widower with hands stained by 40 years of scrapyard grease and eyes that had seen every piece of iron in the state of Kentucky. He had seen Loretta's $4 receipt at the municipal office and had recognized the sterling spirit in her bid, a recognition that most of the town was too blind to see. Silas didn't ask for permission. He simply started unloading a portable generator and a roll of heavy-duty plastic sheeting. "Steel gets stronger the more you fire it, Mrs. Vance," Silas said, tipping his cap as he hooked up the first light bulb the house had seen in 50 years. "I reckon you've been in the kiln long enough. This house has good bones, even if the skin is a bit tattered. I just hate seeing a good piece of iron go to waste." With the hum of Silas's generator and the warmth of Doris's soup, the Sterling house began to feel less like a tomb and more like a fortress. Loretta spent the rest of the day on her knees, armed with a wire brush and a bucket of vinegar and baking soda, attacking the 40 years of neglect with a methodical, rhythmic intensity. Each stroke of the brush was a strike against the silence of the appliance. Oh, a physical scrubbing away of the submissiveness that had coated her soul as thickly as the grime on the floor. Her hands ached and her back felt as if it were being carved by knives, but for the first time in her life, the pain belonged to her. It wasn't the pain of being pruned by Victor. It was the pain of a seed finally cracking its shell to reach the sun. The blue-black bruises on her knees were no longer signs of despondency. They were a physical map of her refusal to be discarded by a world that valued luxury over life. As the second night fell over the Sterling property, the atmosphere was entirely different from the first. The leaks in the roof had been patched with Silas's plastic, and a single, glowing light bulb in the kitchen cast long, warm shadows against the walls she had begun to clean. Loretta sat at the small wooden table Silas had salvaged from his truck, watching as Doris carefully turned the yellowed pages of the Sterling diary. The smell of the house was changing. The rot was being pushed back by the sharp, clean scent of vinegar and the lingering fragrance of the wild mint she had placed in a glass of water. She felt the heavy tectonic shift of her own spirit, a realization that the shade tree of her marriage was truly gone. And though the clearing was cold, the air was finally her own to breathe. She wasn't happy yet, and she certainly wasn't safe, But she was no longer a ghost in a cardigan waiting for someone else to tell her she was allowed to exist. Loretta Vance ended her first week in the ruin not with a prayer for rescue, but with a vow of reconstruction. She looked at her hands, red, swollen, and covered in the dust of a forgotten legacy, and realized they were the most powerful tools she had ever owned. She looked at the wild mint sprout, which was already beginning to unfurl a new set of leaves in the window, and felt a quiet, burning determination that Victor could never touch. He had left her with nothing but trash, but he had forgotten that Loretta was the one who knew how to turn waste into wealth and rot into roses. As she lay down to sleep on a makeshift bed near the kitchen stove, the magnetic intuition whispered one final truth before the darkness took her. The earth beneath her feet wasn't just dirt. It was a foundation that had been waiting 70 years for a gardener with the strength to dig. The shade tree was dead, but the deep roots were finally beginning to stir, and Loretta Vance was ready to see what would bloom in the winter. Loretta's hands, once kept soft and useless for Victor's high society cocktail parties, began to change as she waged a silent, relentless war against 40 years of neglect. The anatomy of the garden became her new language, a sacred dialogue between her stiff, arthritic fingers and the stubborn, frost-hardened Kentucky earth. She didn't use the loud, expensive power tools Victor favored. She relied on her master herbalist knowledge, using vinegar, baking soda, and a wire brush to scrub the history of failure from the sterling walls. Every rhythmic stroke of the brush was like a surgical cut, pruning away the suffocating layers of the appliance mindset that had kept her spirit dormant. She spent her days on her knees, the blue-black bruises on her skin acting as a badge of honor rather than a sign of her husband's victory. The smell of rotted drywall was slowly being replaced by the sharp, clean scent of cedar oil and vinegar, a fragrance that cleared her lungs of the dusty taste of her former life. She realized that grafting a new life onto an old heart required a sharp cut and a lot of binding. But for the first time in 71 years, Loretta was the one holding the knife. The reconstruction of her spirit was mirrored by the arrival of her small, defiant circle of allies who refused to let the great Victor Vance win by default. 72-year-old Doris Miller, the retired librarian who had known Loretta since they were girls in pigtails, became the intellectual heart of the operation, arriving every morning with a satchel of historical records and a thermos of hope. Doris spent her hours in the attic, her librarian's eyes scanning old land grants and municipal logs, determined to find the truth that Oak Haven's Old Boys Club had tried to bury. Alongside her was Silas Rusty Young, a 68-year-old widower and scrapyard owner whose grease-stained hands had built half the machines in the county. Silas didn't see a discarded ghost when he looked at Loretta. He saw a piece of high-grade steel that had been tempered in a fire he knew all too well. He brought his portable generator and rolls of heavy-duty plastic, claiming he just hated seeing a good piece of iron go to waste. But the way he tipped his cap to Loretta told a story of deep, unspoken respect. Together, the three of them began to peel back the layers of a legacy that had been strangled by wild honeysuckle and black walnut trees for over 70 years. While Silas patched the roof and Doris cataloged the attic, Loretta turned her attention to the back acre, a tangled jungle of overgrown weeds that seemed to be hiding more than just poor soil. She moved through the vegetation with the precision of a soil whisperer, identifying heirloom seeds and medicinal roots that had survived the neglect by growing deep and strong. The work was grueling, her back feeling as if it were being carved by knives, and her breath coming in short puffs of white mist in the late autumn air. She was no longer whispering to avoid disturbing a husband. She was breathing heavily, her lungs filling with the raw, honest air of the Appalachian foothills. The shade tree of her marriage was truly dead, and as she cleared away the dead vines, she felt the first true warmth of the sun on her face, a sensation she had forgotten existed during her long decades in the mansion's shadows. The transition from destruction to discovery happened on a Tuesday morning, when the ground was still silver with the first hard frost of the season. Loretta was clearing a thick, aggressive patch of black walnut saplings when her shovel didn't hit the soft give of Kentucky mud, but something cold, hard, and undeniably metallic. The sound it made? A sharp, ringing clink, echoed through the silent garden like a bell calling a congregation to order. Her magnetic intuition suddenly surged in her chest, a physical vibration so strong it made her drop the shovel and sink to her knees in the dirt. She began to dig with her bare hands, the cold mud getting under her fingernails and caking her knuckles. But she didn't feel the chill. As she cleared away 6 inches of mud and decades of rotted leaves, the corner of a massive gray concrete slab began to emerge, its edges perfectly straight and unnatural against the organic curves of the garden. It was a foundation hidden where no foundation should be, a secret buried deep within the earth. As Loretta worked to uncover the rest of the slab, she realized that the property's biohazard label had been a carefully constructed lie designed to keep people away from this very spot. The slab was nearly 10 feet wide, covered in a thick layer of moss that felt like velvet under her trembling fingers, hiding a secret that Elias Sterling had taken to his grave in 1957. Silas heard her call and came running from the house, his heavy boots thudding against the iron-hard ground as he saw what she had uncovered. "Mrs. Vance, this isn't just a foundation," Silas whispered, his voice full of a rare, breathless wonder as he helped her scrape away the final layer of debris. "This is a vault. Look at the seal on that iron. That's Sterling's mark. People in Oakhaven used to say he was a crazy hermit, but a crazy man doesn't build a door like this in the middle of a garden." The mystery of the $4 house was finally starting to crack open, revealing a truth that was far more valuable than the land it sat upon. Loretta cleared the last of the mud from the center of the slab, revealing a heavy, rusted iron ring that bit into her palm with a jagged, cold texture. It was encrusted with 70 years of Kentucky soil, a secret anchor that had remained undisturbed while the town of Oakhaven grew around it. She knew that pulling this ring would either reveal the reason for her $4 bid or confirm the town's mockery, and her heart began to hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. Before we witness the moment Loretta and Silas pry open this buried mystery, please consider subscribing to our channel and liking this video if you find Loretta's journey as moving as we do. Your support is what allows us to keep bringing these stories of hidden strength and justice to light. What lay beneath the iron ring was about to change the landscape of Oakhaven forever, transforming a woman discarded as trash into the guardian of a legacy that Victor Vance could never have imagined in his greediest dreams. The opening of the slab was not a silent affair. It was a heavy, tectonic thud that seemed to vibrate through the very bedrock of Oakhaven. Silas used his heavy-duty crowbar and a mechanical jack from his truck, his muscles straining against the weight of 70 years of silence until the concrete finally yielded with a long, ghostly sigh of trapped air. Beneath the slab lay a narrow stone staircase leading into a darkness that smelled not of rot, but of ancient cedar wood and dried lavender. Loretta led the way, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom to reveal a subterranean chamber that was perfectly dry and meticulously organized. The walls were lined with cedar shelves, each one holding thousands of small glass jars filled with the heirloom seeds Elias Sterling had spent his life protecting. It was a cathedral of growth, a biological treasury that held the original, drought-resistant strains of grain that had built the state of Kentucky before the corporate monocultures of men like Victor Vance had taken over. In the center of the vault sat a small, reinforced iron safe, and resting on top of it was a weathered, leather-bound journal wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the passage of time. Loretta picked it up, her hands shaking so violently the pages fluttered like the wings of a dying moth, and she began to read the elegant, looped script of Elias Sterling. "To the one who has the patience to dig," she read aloud, her voice trembling but gaining strength with every word. This land was never just dirt. It holds the master deed to the Oakhaven Valley and the original patent for the seeds that feed this earth. If you found this, you are the steward now. Use it to feed the hungry and silence the wolves. Silas and Doris stood beside her in the dim light, the silence in the vault so thick it felt like a physical presence. Loretta realized in that moment that she hadn't been a victim of a cruel auction. She had been the only person in Kentucky with the spirit to recognize the treasure hidden beneath the mud. The discovery of the master deed inside the safe was the ultimate revelation. A yellowed piece of parchment that looked like dried skin and bore the town's original wax seal, a deep, blood-red crown. As Doris scanned the legal descriptions with her practiced librarian's eye, a look of slow, mounting triumph spread across her face. "Loretta, do you realize what this is?" Doris whispered, her finger tracing the boundaries of the Sterling estate. "This deed was never updated or legally superseded. The land Victor is building his new $20 million shopping plaza on. It's part of the original Sterling grant. He doesn't own the ground under his feet. You do." The irony was as sharp as a winter frost. The man who had told Loretta she wouldn't survive a month was currently building his empire on a foundation of stolen soil that belonged to the woman he had discarded as trash. The master key had been found, and the balance of power in Oakhaven was about to shift in a way that would leave the town speechless. With the resources found in the vault, not just the seeds, but a small cache of gold coins Sterling had saved for a rainy day, the reconstruction of the Sterling property accelerated at a dizzying pace. Loretta didn't buy luxury. She bought the best soil, the finest glass for a greenhouse, and the help of local workers who had been pushed aside by Victor's corporate machines. The shack was transformed into a gleaming white cottage with a wraparound porch that smelled of fresh paint and pine, a sanctuary that glowed like a beacon against the dark Appalachian foothills. The jungle of the backyard was tamed into a world-class botanical garden, where the heirloom seeds from the vault began to sprout in vibrant, defiant rows. It was no longer a landfill. It was a Sterling sanctuary, a place where the air felt cleaner and the light seemed to linger longer than anywhere else in town. Loretta moved through the gardens with a new fluidity, her stoop replaced by a steady, powerful grace that came from knowing her own worth. As the winter months passed, Loretta's reputation in Oakhaven began to undergo a radical transformation, moving from the crazy $4 lady to the lady of the garden. She began to use her master herbalist skills to create healing tinctures and medicinal teas from the rare plants she had rescued, giving them away for free to the town's elderly who were struggling with the cold. Word spread quickly through the local markets and church basements. Loretta Vance had the cure for everything from joint pain to the deep, hollow insomnia of the lonely. People started visiting the Sterling property not to mock, but to seek advice, finding a woman who sat on her porch with a steady gaze and hands that were always stained with the rich, dark soil of her success. She was becoming the heart of a community that Victor had tried to turn into a sterile marketplace, a living reminder that the deepest roots grow in the darkest dirt. The contrast between Loretta's new life and her former existence was most evident in the way she interacted with the world around her. She no longer whispered. Her voice was clear, articulated, and carried a weight of authority that silenced the skeptics. She spent her evenings in the vault with Doris, cataloging the thousands of seeds and realizing that some were worth a fortune to agricultural researchers who were desperate for drought-resistant strains. Silas became a permanent fixture on the property, his scrapyard skills being put to use, building a sophisticated irrigation system that hummed with a low, mechanical efficiency. The silence of the appliance had been replaced by the vibrant, chaotic symphony of a living garden, a sound that Victor Vance would have hated, but that Loretta found more beautiful than any gala music she had ever heard. She was no longer a ghost in a cardigan. She was a woman who had reclaimed her name and her legacy from the mud of a Kentucky winter. By the time the first hints of spring began to touch the Appalachian foothills, the Sterling Sanctuary was fully established as a place of beauty and purpose. The house was a masterpiece of simple, elegant restoration, its gleaming white walls reflecting the pale morning sun like a promise kept. The garden was a sea of silver and blue at dawn, the mist rising off the bluegrass to hide the scars of the reconstruction until the light was strong enough to reveal the blossoms. Loretta stood in the center of her creation, looking at the wild mint sprout she had found on her first night. Now, a massive, fragrant bush that anchored the kitchen garden. She felt a profound sense of peace, a quiet, burning certainty that she had already won the war. Victor didn't even know she was fighting. She was established, she was loved, and she was the owner of the very ground that would soon become the site of Victor's greatest failure. The final days of the reconstruction were a time of quiet reflection before the storm of the confrontation arrived. Loretta sat on her porch one evening, drinking a cup of the wild mint tea that tasted sharp, medicinal, and cold on her tongue, clearing the last dusty taste of the mansion from her throat. She looked at her hands, red, strong, and vibrating with the unseen life of the soil, and realized they were the most powerful tools she had ever owned. She had turned a ruin into a sanctuary and a betrayal into a bridge, proving to herself and to Oakhaven that a woman's resilience is like a deep well aquifer, silent but inexhaustible. The shade tree was dead, but the deep roots were finally in full bloom, and as the lights of the town twinkled in the distance, Loretta Vance knew that she was finally ready to face the man who had said she would never survive. The garden was ready. The deed was in the safe, and the air was finally her own to breathe. The morning the silence of the Sterling Sanctuary was finally shattered by the arrival of the past, the Kentucky sky was a brilliant, unyielding blue that made the white paint of the restored cottage gleam like a pearl. Loretta was sitting on her wraparound porch, her hands wrapped around a warm ceramic mug of her wild mint tea, when the low, aggressive rumble of a high-end engine began to vibrate through the floorboards. A shiny black SUV, its windows tinted to a charcoal darkness, crawled up the gravel driveway with a predatory slowness, looking like a massive grease stain against the vibrant, flower-lined path of her gardens. The chemical, expensive, new car smell of the vehicle preceded it, a synthetic odor of plastic and leather that felt like a direct threat to the natural, earthy fragrance of the lavender and cedar surrounding the porch. Loretta didn't stand up, and she didn't put down her tea. She simply watched as the door opened and Victor Vance stepped out, his $2,000 suit looking absurdly out of place against the raw, honest beauty of the Appalachian foothills. Victor didn't just walk toward the porch. He marched with the entitled stride of a man who believed he still owned every square inch of the ground beneath his feet. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, his face a mask of calculated concern that didn't quite hide the sharp, flickering panic in his eyes. He looked up at Loretta, who sat in her rocking chair with a steady, unblinking gaze that she had never dared to use in the mansion. "Loretta," he said, his voice carrying that familiar, condescending weight she had spent 40 years trying to escape. "I've been hearing some interesting things about this little project of yours. It's impressive, in a rustic sort of way. But I think we both know this game has gone on long enough." He adjusted his tie, the gold signet ring on his finger catching the morning sun with a sharp, high-pitched clink as it tapped against his thigh. He was looking at her as if she were still that discarded appliance he had unplugged, failing to realize that the woman sitting before him was now powered by the very earth he was trying to colonize. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant, rhythmic chirping of a cardinal in the black walnut trees, a sound that Victor clearly found irritating as he wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. He looked at the pristine white cottage, then at the sprawling rows of rare roses and medicinal herbs, and his eyes narrowed with a desperate, animal-like cunning. "All right, Loretta," he said, his voice dropping into the smooth, practiced tone he used when he was about to gut a business rival. "You had your little adventure, and I'll admit, you've done a decent job with this dump. I'm feeling generous today. I'll give you $50,000 for a signature on a simple easement release. That's a fortune for a woman your age, more than enough to put you in one of those luxury senior communities you've been eyeing." He waved a check with a flourish, the paper fluttering in the light breeze. Like a white flag of surrender, he was trying to pass off as a trophy. He honestly believed that the weight of his money would still be enough to bend her to his will. Loretta looked at the check, then back at Victor, and a sound escaped her throat that she hadn't made in 4 decades. A soft, genuine laugh that echoed through the garden like a clear bell. She didn't reach for the paper. She didn't even lean forward. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate sip of her tea, letting the sharp, medicinal coldness of the mint clear the last dusty taste of her former life from her palate. "50,000, Victor?" she asked, her voice clear and articulated, carrying a weight of authority that seemed to make the very air around the porch grow still. "You've spent 40 years telling me I didn't understand how the world works. Yet you arrive here with a handful of paper that wouldn't cover the cost of a single drought-resistant seed from my vault. You're standing on a subterranean treasury that contains the original patents for the grain that built this state. And you think a senior community is my ambition? You don't have enough zeros in your bank account to buy a single petal from my garden." The mask of the great man finally began to crumble, revealing the hollow, terrified narcissist underneath as the reality of her words began to sink in. Victor's face flushed a deep, angry red, his signet ring tapping a frantic, irregular rhythm against the porch railing. "Don't play games with me, Loretta. I know about the legal cloud your lawyers are trying to stir up," he hissed, his voice losing its corporate polish and turning into a jagged snarl. "My shopping plaza is stalled because of some ancient, irrelevant piece of paper you dug out of the mud. I've got investors breathing down my neck and millions on the line. You're going to sign that release, or I'll make sure you spend your final years in a courtroom instead of a garden." He stepped closer, his shadow falling across her feet like a cold, dark stain. But Loretta didn't flinch. She felt the magnetic intuition humming in her chest, a steady, grounding vibration that told her the earth itself was standing as her witness. Loretta set her tea mug down on the small wooden table with a soft, final thud, and leaned forward just enough to look Victor directly in his eyes, eyes that were now darting around the property like a trapped animal's. "You told me I wouldn't survive a month without your name and your wallet to protect me, Victor. It's been 8, she said, her voice dropping into a calm that was far more devastating than any scream could ever be. In that time, I've learned that the only thing you ever provided for me was a cage made of expensive marble and silence. You aren't here out of mercy, and you aren't here out of generosity. You're here because you've realized that every brick of that $20 million plaza you're so proud of is sitting on soil that belongs to the Sterling estate. And since I am the legal owner of that estate, you are currently trespassing on my land. I've spent my life watching you prune others to grow your own ego. But you've finally met a root you can't cut." Victor's arrogance was replaced by a visible, physical tremor as he realized that the master deed Doris had uncovered wasn't just a threat. It was a death sentence for his empire. He looked around the Sterling sanctuary, seeing for the first time the hidden power of the vault and the undeniable legality of the legacy Loretta had reclaimed from the rot. "You'll regret this, Loretta! I'll tie you up in court until you're 90! "Ahem," he shouted, his voice cracking with the strain of his own desperation. "I'll drain every penny you found in that hole. You think Oakhaven will stand for this? You think they'll let an old woman stop a project that brings jobs to this town?" He was flailing now, grabbing at the old levers of power that no longer worked in this clearing. Loretta simply watched him, seeing a man who was nothing more than a pesticide, a destructive but shallow force that had finally run out of ground to poison. Loretta stood up then, her movement fluid and strong, her slight stoop completely gone as she stood at her full height on the porch. She looked out over her garden, where the morning mist was still rising off the bluegrass in silver waves, and then back at the man who had spent 40 years trying to make her invisible. "Then I'll spend those 20 years watching my roses grow, Victor," she replied, her voice echoing with a quiet, burning triumph that seemed to fill the entire valley. "I'll spend my days breeding the seeds that will feed the hungry, while you spend yours watching your lawyers drain you dry to defend a project that was built on a foundation of stolen soil and a fragile ego. You've built a kingdom on a landfill, and the ground is finally opening up to take it back. Now get off my grass. You're staining it with your presence. And I have far more important work to do than listening to the whispers of a ghost." The final dismissal was surgical, a clean cut that severed the last cord of the silence of the appliance, once and for all. Victor Vance, the man who had once ruled Oakhaven with a gold ring and a cold heart, looked at the woman standing on the porch and saw something he couldn't comprehend. A person who was truly, fundamentally free. He opened his mouth to deliver one final insult, but the words seemed to die in the clean, lavender-scented air before they could reach her. He turned and stumbled back toward his SUV, his expensive shoes slipping on the pristine gravel path he had tried to claim. "You should leave now, Victor," Loretta said, her voice as steady as the iron-hard Kentucky mud in winter. "The air here is finally clean, and you're starting to make it smell like rot again." He didn't look back. He simply climbed into his vehicle and sped away, the tires throwing up a cloud of dust that was quickly swallowed by the morning breeze. As the roar of the SUV faded into the distance, a profound and heavy silence returned to the Sterling sanctuary, but it was no longer the silence of a tomb. It was the vibrant, expectant stillness of a garden waiting for the sun to reach its zenith. Loretta sat back down in her rocking chair, her heart beating with a slow, powerful rhythm that felt perfectly in sync with the humming of the vault beneath her feet. She knew that the confrontation was only the beginning of Victor's fall, and that the legal storm would soon break over Vance Corp with a force that would leave the great man in ruins. The investors would pull out by the end of the week, the bank would foreclose on the half-finished plaza, and the empire built on the silence of the appliance would finally collapse. Into the very dirt he had mocked, Loretta took a final sip of her wild mint tea, the flavor sharp and cold on her tongue, and she smiled as she watched a single honeybee land on a nearby rose. The consequence for Victor was as absolute as it was deserved, a slow-motion wrecking ball that dismantled his life with the same clinical efficiency he had used on Loretta. Within 2 months, the great Victor Vance was forced to declare a humiliating bankruptcy, his assets frozen and his reputation in Oakhaven scorched by the revelation of the master deed. The 40-year-old fiancée, seeing the writing on the wall, had vanished with whatever jewelry she could carry, leaving Victor to face the wreckage alone. He ended up living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment above a noisy laundromat on the edge of town, the very kind of place he had once described as trash. He spent his days sitting by a window that overlooked a gray parking lot, the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the washing machines below serving as a mockery of the signet ring he had been forced to sell to pay his legal fees. He was no longer the king of Oakhaven. He was just a bitter, forgotten man, living in the shadow of the woman he had discarded. The peace that settled over the Sterling property after the departure of the vilified past was a physical presence, a sanctuary that felt more solid than any mansion Loretta had ever inhabited. She spent the rest of the day in the garden with Silas and Doris, the three of them working in a comfortable, wordless harmony as they prepared the heirloom seeds for the coming spring. The magnetic intuition was no longer a frantic pull, but a warm, steady glow in her chest, a battery that seemed to charge with every handful of soil she touched. Loretta looked at her hands, red, strong, and covered in the dark, rich dirt of her success, and realized that the shade tree of her marriage was truly gone, and in its place, a forest of her own making was beginning to rise. The confrontation was over. The air was clean, and for the first time in 71 years, Loretta Vance knew exactly what it felt like to stand on ground that was truly her own. The air in Oakhaven had changed by the following summer, no longer tasting of Victor's cold, corporate efficiency, but of the rich, humid breath of a living forest. The Sterling sanctuary stood as a gleaming white beacon against the emerald slopes of the Appalachian foothills, its wraparound porch draped in the deep purple of heirloom clematis and the vibrant green of climbing ivy. It was August, and the garden was in its full, defiant glory, a symphony of silver-blue grasses and rare medicinal herbs that seemed to pulse with the unseen energy of the subterranean vault below. Loretta moved through the rows with a steady, rhythmic grace, her slight stoop a distant memory, replaced by a grounded strength that came from the very soil she had reclaimed from the rot. The shack that was once a biohazard was now a world-class center for botanical research and healing, a place where the history of Kentucky was being replanted one seed at a time. This wasn't just a property anymore. It was a testament to the fact that the deepest roots grow in the darkest dirt, and that a woman discarded as trash could become the architect of a legacy that would outlive every skyscraper Victor Vance ever dreamed of building. Every morning, the gravel driveway of the sanctuary was filled not with aggressive SUVs, but with the modest cars of local families and the bicycles of young researchers who traveled from across the state to study the Sterling seeds. Loretta had become the Lady of the Garden, a title given to her by the townspeople who once mocked her $4 bid at the municipal auction. She spent her days teaching young mothers how to brew tinctures for their children's fevers and showing local farmers the drought-resistant strains of grain that were now being harvested in golden fields across the valley. The silence of the appliance was gone forever, replaced by the vibrant, messy, and beautiful noise of a community being restored by the hands of a woman they had tried to erase. Loretta no longer felt the need to ask for permission to exist. She was the one who provided the foundation for others to grow. Her presence as essential as the sun. The smell of cedar and lavender followed her everywhere, a permanent reminder that her vault was no longer a secret bunker, but an open pantry for a world hungry for truth. She was no longer a ghost in a cardigan, but a steward of life. Her voice clear and articulated as she shared the wisdom she had unearthed from the Kentucky mud. Beside her stood Doris Miller, who had undergone a transformation as profound and as beautiful as the house itself. The 72-year-old retired librarian was no longer a woman relegated to the dusty, forgotten corners of a municipal building. She was now the official curator of the Sterling Archives and the sanctuary's intellectual heart. Doris spent her hours in the cool, cedar-scented vault, her fingers moving across the original land grants and Elias Sterling's leather-bound journals with a sense of fierce, intellectual belonging she had never known. She had helped Loretta mount the legal battle that finally dismantled Victor's empire, proving that a librarian with a sense of justice is far more powerful than a lawyer with a sense of greed. Doris had found her own rebellion in the rows of heirloom seeds, realizing that her life's purpose wasn't just to catalog the past, but to protect the future from men who believed they could own the earth with a signature and a lie. The two women often sat on the porch at sunset, watching the mist rise off the bluegrass in silver waves, two childhood friends who had survived the pruning of their youth to become the massive oaks of their own old age. Their friendship, the binding that held the new sanctuary together. Silas Rusty Young was never far away, his heavy boots leaving rhythmic, muddy prints on the white porch that Loretta no longer minded cleaning with her wire brush. The 68-year-old widower had found more than just a project in the Sterling sanctuary. He had found a family and a reason to keep his tools sharp. His scrapyard skills had been the mechanical backbone of the reconstruction, building the intricate irrigation system that hummed like a contented bee beneath the flower beds and restoring the iron gates that now welcomed the town. Silas was no longer the man who looked at a piece of iron and saw only its weight in scrap. He saw the Sterling spirit in every bolt and beam he touched for Loretta. He had moved his workshop to a refurbished barn on the edge of the property, where he taught local veterans how to work with their hands, showing them that even the most rusted tool can be fired in the kiln and made stronger than it was before. For Silas, the sanctuary was a place where the grief of his wife's death had finally been composted into something productive, a quiet, steady companionship with Loretta that didn't need words to be understood, his life finally possessing a weight that no scrapyard scale could ever measure. In the sharpest and most satisfying contrast to the vibrant life of the garden stood the remains of Victor Vance's world, a reality that had shrunk until it was as small and hollow as his own narcissism. The man who had once ruled Oakhaven with a gold signet ring and a cold heart now lived in a cramped one-bedroom apartment above a noisy laundromat on the edge of town, the very kind of place he had once described as a landfill for human failure. The great Victor Vance had been exposed as a man whose empire was built on stolen soil and fragile legal loopholes, and when his investors realized the master deed was valid, they fled his presence like rats from a sinking ship. He had been forced to declare a humiliating bankruptcy, his assets frozen and his reputation scorched by the revelation of his own greed. He spent his days sitting by a small, greasy window that overlooked an oil-stained parking lot, the rhythmic, hollow thump-thump-thump of the industrial washing machines below, serving as a constant mockery of the signet ring he had been forced to sell. He was surrounded by the very trash he had once claimed Loretta belonged with, living a life of sterile, cheap silence, where the only thing that grew was the cold, gray mold of his own bitterness. Victor would sometimes see Loretta's face on the local news, talking about the sanctuary or the latest harvest of sterling grain, and he would turn the television off with a trembling hand, realizing too late that the woman he called an appliance was the only thing that had ever been real in his life. The 40-year-old fiancée, seeing the writing on the wall, had vanished with whatever jewelry she could carry, leaving Victor to face the wreckage of his own design without a single ally to his name. He was the one who was truly alone now, a ghost haunting a one-bedroom apartment, while Loretta thrived in a cathedral of growth. The sound of the laundromat machines was the only heartbeat his home possessed, a mechanical reminder that his time as the king of Oakhaven was over. He had spent 40 years using Loretta as a foundation, and now that the building had collapsed, he found himself buried in the rubble of his own making. He had once told her she wouldn't survive a month without his protection, but as he looked at the gray Kentucky sky through his cracked window, he realized that he was the one who was barely clinging to existence, a discarded shadow in a world that had moved on to a more beautiful and honest season. As the morning sun reached its zenith over the Appalachian foothills, Loretta knelt in the center of her greenhouse, her fingers pressing a handful of heirloom seeds into the warm, sun-baked Kentucky soil. She paused for a moment, looking at her hands, red, strong, and covered in the dark, rich dirt that vibrated with the unseen life of thousands of worms and microbes. They were the perfect image mirror of the hands that had once clutched 4 damp, crumpled dollars at a municipal auction, shaking with fear and the weight of a husband's public mockery. Back then, her hands were thin and translucent, the skin like parchment that Victor threatened to tear with a single, sharp word. Now, they were the hands of a creator, powerful and steady, holding the potential for 1,000 future harvests in their palms. She remembered the day Attorney Thorne had dropped the keys into the oily mud at her feet, and she smiled at the memory, realizing that the mud hadn't been an insult, but an invitation from the earth itself. The dirt had asked her to reach into the dark to find her own strength, and she had answered with a persistence that had eventually turned a $4 ruin into a sanctuary of justice and life. Loretta realized that Victor had been right about one thing on the day of their divorce. The woman she was back then could never have survived this journey. The Loretta who whispered so as not to disturb his thoughts. The woman who wore gray cardigans to disappear into the mansion's wallpaper, and the wife who asked for permission to buy a carton of eggs. That woman had truly died in the rot of the Sterling kitchen. She had been pruned away by the cold and the hunger, her submissiveness acting as a dormant shell that had to crack before the lady of the garden could emerge into the light. She had unlearned the habit of silence and replaced it with the language of the Sterling sanctuary, a dialogue of growth and perennial strength that required no one's approval but her own. The shade tree of her marriage was gone, and while the clearing had been cold at first, the sun was finally strong enough to warm her soul. She hadn't just survived the winter, she had used it to temper her spirit into something that could never be broken again, proving that a woman's resilience is like a deep well aquifer, silent but inexhaustible, waiting for the right moment to reach the surface and change the world. The peace that settled over the Sterling property was a physical presence, a sanctuary that felt more solid and permanent than any mansion Loretta had ever inhabited. She stood at the edge of the back acre, looking at the massive, fragrant bush of wild mint that had grown from the tiny sprout she found on her first night of despair. It was the centerpiece of the garden now, a lush green anchor that filled the air with a scent that was sharp, medicinal, and undeniably defiant against the cold Kentucky morning. Loretta felt a profound sense of peace, a quiet, burning certainty that she had finally balanced the scales of her own life and the legacy of Elias Sterling. She realized that the world's ruins are so often just treasures waiting for a gardener with the patience to dig, and that the ground we walk on is always waiting to reveal its secrets to those who aren't afraid of the mud. Her journey had come full circle, from the single suitcase on a rainy porch to a thriving estate that fed both the body and the soul of Oakhaven. She was 71 years old when Victor told her she would never survive, and now, as she looked at the vibrant life around her, she realized she was the most powerful she had ever been. Loretta's story is a powerful reminder for all of us that no matter how many people tell you that you are discarded or past your prime, your true value is something that can never be appraised by a man like Victor Vance. Perhaps you are currently standing in your own version of a ruined house, feeling the cold weight of a world that has decided you are no longer useful or worthy of a seat at the table. If that is where you are today, I want you to remember Loretta's hands in the mud. It was only by reaching into the dark that she found the master key to her own legacy and the strength to stand tall. We are so honored to have you as part of our global community, and hearing your thoughts on these stories of hidden strength is what keeps us inspired to share them with you every single day. Please take a moment to tell us in the comments what part of Loretta's journey resonated most with your own life. And if you haven't already, subscribe and like this video to ensure you never miss a narrative of justice, restoration, and the incredible power of the human spirit. Your support helps us grow this garden of stories, and we truly value every minute you spend with us. As the morning sun warmed the Kentucky soil, vibrating with the unseen life of thousands of microbes, Loretta Vance closed her eyes and smiled, knowing that she hadn't just survived the storm, she had become the harvest. She thought of the woman who had once stood on the courthouse steps, wet and broken, and she whispered a silent thank you to the cold rain that had forced her to seek shelter in a $4 ruin. Victor had said she wouldn't survive, but he had failed to realize that Loretta was a perennial, a force of nature that only needed a little bit of space and a lot of heart to find her own way back to the light. She had reclaimed the right to her own breath and the power of her own name, proving to herself and to the world that you are never too old to dig for your own truth. The shade tree was dead, but the deep roots were in full bloom, and as the laughter of her friends filled the air, Loretta Vance took a final breath of the clean, lavender-scented air. He was right about one thing. The woman she used to be didn't survive, but the woman who stood up in her place didn't just survive. She bloomed, and in that blooming, she had finally found her home.